created all of our ruffles, it's time to add the ruffles to our girl. You're going to need scissors and straight pins for this process. I always add ruffles from the bottom up. It's easier to sew each layer on top of the next layer instead of trying to push the layers out of the way to sew them below each other. I fold over the edge of the ruffle strip about 1/2 inch and pin it in place just outside of her white dress. I let that bottom layer overlap the bottom of the quilt or overlap the binding. You can have it hang well below the binding if you like, but I usually have mine line up fairly close with the edge of the binding. Stretch the ruffle strip across her dress and cut it about 1/2 inch outside of her dress. Fold this under and pin it in place. I personally like to pin on each layer and then sew it in place. So that's what I'm going to do with this bottom layer. And I'm going to sew it with white thread, being sure to back tack at each end. I use a very small stitch length for this so that I make sure that it's very secure and can hold the collection that we're going to stitch into the ruffles. So there's our first strip sewn in place, and it's time to add the second layer. Since this is a new process for most of you, I will go ahead and lay out all of the layers of my girl so I can know exactly how many I want. I like to have layers in odd numbers, so 5, 7, or 9 layers. Since the first layer is already stitched in place, I'm going to pin the second layer to the quilt, folding over 1/2 inch at each end. You can determine if you would like to place the ruffles closer or further apart. I usually have them overlap so that you can't see the previous layer's stitching. And I'm going to lay out each of the layers on the quilt, not pinning them in place, just making sure to fold over 1/2 inch on each end until I have enough ruffles to cover from the bottom of her dress up to her waistline. And her waistline is where we've made that undershirt. It'll be just above the edge of the undershirt, and you can see that peeking through on the background there. Usually about where her hands meet her dress. And there we go. I've got 7 layers, and I like that layout. That's plenty. I'm going to set all the layers aside so I can see which ones go in what order. I'll begin stitching them in place, being sure to back tack over at each end. After sewing the 3rd layer, I've now pinned in place the 4th layer, and I'm going to stitch it on the quilt, pin on the 5th layer, stitch it to the quilt, add my 6th layer, and now ready for the final layer. Now at this point, if you don't want the top edge of your ruffles to be seen, you could cover them with ribbon as you stitch them on. But I like to have that little ruffled edge at the top, so I like to leave it just as is. So there's our girl. She's ready for her collection.